actual scenery. The thrill of a water slide turned into a terrifying lesson.
It takes a very special person to have a memorial race in someone's honor.
Somewhere between midnight and the early morning hours of August 18th, 2005, in an old, abandoned deep cave beneath the Y Mountain, located just to the east of Brigham Young University in Utah, a group of 4 adventurers begin swimming their way out through the water-filled tunnel. It's only about 4.5 meters or 15 feet long, and these folks are not only young and enthusiastic, but also somewhat familiar with the place. With all that going for them, this stone's throw of a swim seemingly looks like a pretty straightforward job, but unfortunately, they would never make it out alive. In the year of 2005, 21-year-old Jennifer Lynn Galbraith had just finished her first year at Utah Valley State College, also known as UVSC, where she was majoring in philosophy. As the youngest of 4 siblings, she had always been full of dreams and adventure. The year she spent at UVSC was everything she had hoped for. She went into photography, played bass guitar, and even scored a few modeling gigs. Following her passions, Jennifer ran into someone with a similar profile, the leading singer of a hardcore rock band named Parallax, as well as an extremely talented painter, John Blake Donor. 24-year-old John from Springville was a third-year student at UVSC, also majoring in philosophy as well as English. Jennifer and John hit it off almost instantly. They started dating, and she joined his band. The couple also ended up being friends with many others from the circle. However, later on, their story would revolve around just 3 more people: 28-year-old Kieran Scott McDonald, 18-year-old Ariel Singer, and 26-year-old Joseph Ferguson, all working with the same band. Besides music though, there was another thing that tied them together. They loved exploring unknown places, and therefore had a bit of hiking background as well. As a matter of fact, in early 2005, Jennifer had gone spelunking in a few of the caves around town. However, the experiences weren't really ideal for her, as she had passed out in some, while ended up getting lost in others. On the night of August 17th of 2005, the band played a gig at a cafe that went off quite successfully. Afterward, Jake shared an exciting update with the group. In 2 days, he was going to review the band's first album, now that it was finally mastered. This was big news, and they were all eager to celebrate. On the way home, they decided to stop for dinner, and that's when Jennifer threw a bold idea at her friends. She revealed that one of her earlier expeditions that year, she had explored an abandoned mine on Y Mountain, which sits east of Brigham Young University. The mountain is famous for the giant Y structure made by students to honor the university, so it was pretty popular among the community statewide, even though it wasn't exactly a hotspot for cavers. Stepping into the mine tunnel, the 1.2 meter tall or 4 foot tall opening was covered by a shallow stream of water, about half a meter deep. Cavers had to crouch down and squeeze through to reach another cavern, which was a gateway to a 15-foot tunnel that was completely filled with water, ending in an even larger cavern. Here, the cavers would pop their heads up through a hole and catch a breath in the small gap between the waist-deep water and the sloped ceiling. This room, which could fit up to 8 people, was known as the Gollum Cave. Apparently, the whole adventure didn't seem too dangerous, but there was a catch. The 4-foot opening, eventually narrowed down into the submerged section, was only as wide as a refrigerator door. This meant only one person could swim through at a time to get to the Gollum Cave. Plus, what initially appeared to be a simple 15-foot swim would turn out to be extremely challenging. The water, fed by an underground stream and accumulated in the limestone rocks over time, was bone-chillingly cold. To make matters worse, this freezing, stagnant water was murky with debris. Even with a headlamp, visibility was next to nothing, making it dangerously easy to get disoriented and lose track of the way out. And if by chance, someone happened to disturb the debris settled on the tunnel's floor, the thick layer of muck would rise like a dark, suffocating, impenetrable cloud of silt, swallowing up any remaining visibility. In an attempt to combat this nerve-wracking disorientation, some experts from previous expeditions had tied a rope through the tunnel, securing it to the rocks at both ends. Clinging to that rope was the only reliable way for explorers to navigate through the murky water. But that wasn't much help for Jennifer, as she recalled being hypothermic during her last visit, nearly blacking out before the group managed to pull her to safety. At the dinner table, Jennifer convinced her friends to join her in checking out the cave she'd been raving about. The rest of the group, just as adventurous as her, eagerly accepted the invite. Somewhere during the conversation, they jokingly called it the Cave of Death, which of course wasn't an official term by any means, but it wouldn't take long to prove itself eerily accurate. Wednesday night, August 17th, quickly blurred into the early hours of August 18th, full of excitement. The group of 5 arrived at the entrance of the mine around 3 a.m., and after spending about an hour and a half exploring the area, they finally decided around 4:30 a.m. to begin their descent into the tunnel. However, one of the friends, Joseph Ferguson, who had come all this way to join the fun, started feeling uneasy when they got to the entrance. Despite their best efforts to reassure him, Joseph couldn't shake the discomfort, so he decided to stay behind, waiting outside the tunnel's entrance for them to return. Little did he know that that decision would turn out to be the best decision of his life. Jennifer and the crew crouched down as they made their way into the cave. With headlamps lighting their path, they began duck walking through the shallow stream, navigating the twists and turns until they hit the 27-meter or 90-foot mark. That's where they encountered the hole in the cave floor that led to the waterway below, opening into the real cave. As expected, until this point the passage got so narrow that they now had to plunge into the water one by one. Jennifer, being the most familiar with the cave, and probably the most pumped for the adventure, took the lead. Grabbing the rope, she dove into the murky water first, and the others watched as she disappeared beneath the surface. One by one, the rest of the group followed, diving into the freezing waterway, gripping the rope for guidance. Eventually, they all surfaced on the other side, emerging from the water into what they would soon know as their very own Cave of Death. As they swam through the icy water, it hit them. They really should have brought wetsuits to deal with the freezing temperatures. But at that point, there was nothing to be done about it, and they weren't planning to stick around for long anyway. The trip was just another casual adventure for them. They'd even strolled in wearing sandals and shorts, treating the whole thing like it was no big deal. But only a few moments into the chest-deep water, they started feeling the shift in the air. Once inside the cave, the breathing space above their heads was barely 1 meter. With the water being so stagnant, not only was there no fresh air circulating, but the decaying microbes in the water were steadily releasing carbon dioxide. Besides that, years of visitors passing through the cave had depleted the oxygen, replacing it with more carbon dioxide. Add to the fact that the limestone walls naturally produce carbon dioxide over time, and someone from an earlier expedition had left candles burning inside the cave, sucking up even more of the oxygen. The air in that cave had turned into a death trap. There's no way the group could have lasted more than a few minutes if they kept breathing in the toxic air. As soon as they realized the dire situation, panic took hold, and 4 of them decided to turn back immediately. But with a narrow passage ahead, only one could squeeze through at a time, leaving the rest to wait for a few agonizing minutes while the person in front made it to the other side. Otherwise, if 2 people collided in the murky water midway, there was a real risk of clogging the tunnel and drowning. The protocols, however, weren't meant for an ideal situation. These folks had just surfaced after a swim, holding their breath, and before that, they had crouched through a tight, almost 27-meter or 90-foot stretch. They were already running low on air, plus the oppressive atmosphere of the cave only added to their desperation, leaving them gasping for breath. So with their oxygen-starved brains, the ability to make a decision went right out the window. Everyone wanted to be the first to get out, but Jennifer, having already been there once again, got the first chance. The others were supposed to wait a minute or two for her to clear the path, but in their panicked state, waiting was the last thing on their minds. 18-year-old Ariel, out of breath and panicking, plunged into the water just a few moments after Jennifer, hoping her friend had already surfaced. What she didn't realize was that something terrible had already unfolded. As soon as Jennifer hit the freezing water, she desperately thrashed her limbs, trying to push through the freezing tunnel with lungs already screaming for air. Her frantic movements stirred up the debris on the cave floor, turning up the already murky water into a clouded mess. With her breath running out and disorientation settling in, she lost her grip on the guide rope and passed out just before reaching the exit hole, therefore clogging the pathway. When Ariel followed, her plunge into the water triggered a similar set of events. Then, just as she was struggling to find her way through, she collided with Jennifer's unconscious body, completely blocking her way out. Despite trying to push through, the narrow, water-filled cave trapped her too, and it didn't take long before she passed out as well. A normal person might have held out a little longer in the choked tunnel, or even attempted to swim back, but with their lungs empty and the water so murky, there was no chance to reverse course. The entire tragedy unfolded in minutes, too quickly for either of them to react. Meanwhile, the two men left in the cave had no clue what happened to their friends just a few meters away. Assuming the girls had already made it out, John decided to dive into the water, but the 4.5 meter or 15-foot tunnel was now restricted by two lifeless bodies in front of him. With no room to move forward and limited oxygen, John blacked out as well, followed by the last member of the group, Scott McDonald, who suffered the same fate. About 45 minutes after they had all entered the cave, Ferguson, waiting outside, started to feel uneasy. He crouched down and entered the cave to see if the group was still around. He made his way to the same waterhole they were supposed to emerge from, but there were no signs of movement or flashlights. Growing concerned, he decided to call out for help. If Ferguson had tried to dive in and reach his friends, he might have faced the same tragic outcome, but luckily, once again, he made the right call. When rescue teams arrived, more than 2 hours had passed since the group had gone in. Thinking they might be trapped in the Gollum cave, the rescue crew began by pumping oxygen into the cave, hoping to help any survivors breathe. When there was no response, they started pumping water out to safely enter the tunnel, a process that took another 4 hours. Once the water level was lowered, the rescue workers entered the cave, fully equipped with safety gear. Tragically, they discovered the drowned bodies of all 4 members, one after another, all facing the same direction. This confirmed that they had died while trying to escape, with their bodies ultimately blocking the tunnel. Later that afternoon, rescue workers sealed the entrance to the cave using rocks and concrete, closing it off permanently. A memorial plaque was placed at the site, engraved with the names of the lost explorers, perhaps an enduring tribute to those who paid the ultimate price for their passion. John Edwards Jones grew up in a lively household with 6 siblings. His dad was the one who introduced him and his brother Josh to the art of exploring caves. At first, crawling around in dark, tight spaces seemed pretty intimidating, but it didn't take long for them to find the thrill in it. The two brothers spent most of their childhood diving into every cave they could find across Utah, losing track of time and getting lost in the adventure, but life had a way of changing things up. By the time John was 26, he was a husband with a 1-year-old daughter and another baby on the way. To top it all off, he had packed up and moved to Virginia to attend medical school, where he was studying to become a pediatric cardiologist. With all these new responsibilities piling up, family, school, a future career, John found himself drifting away from his pastime he had loved so much as a kid, and he wasn't really happy about it. That longing, however, wouldn't last forever. November 2009 rolled around, and Jones headed back to Utah for Thanksgiving to catch up with his family. During his big reunion, he decided it was a perfect time to dive back into his old childhood hobby, but there was no way he was going to do it without his old caving buddy, so he roped his older brother Josh into the plan too. Now, with all the excitement and determination brewing, the task was to pick the right spot for their epic return to spelunking. It had to be wild and packed with adrenaline, something that would really mark their comeback. And in Utah, there was only one cave that fit that description perfectly, the Nutty Putty. Located just west of Utah Lake, it's a 145-foot deep hydrothermal abyss known for its winding paths and super tight squeezes. This reputation made it a must-visit spot for spelunkers and cave enthusiasts from all over the world. At one point, it was pulling in over 5,000 visitors a year, but with no real system in place to monitor who was going in and out, plenty of folks would end up heading into the cave late at night without taking the proper safety precautions. Besides that, the heavy foot traffic had worn down the rock inside the cave, making the already narrow passages dangerously slippery. By 2006, authorities were raising red flags, saying a part of the cave known as the Big Slide, with its 45-degree angle, wasn't safe to enter anymore. After a couple of scary incidents where people got stuck, they decided to shut it down for a while, putting a gate at the entrance to keep people out. Fast forward 3 years, and they decided to reopen it, completely unaware that something far more terrifying was going to happen. Every section of the Nutty Putty Cave had a distinctive name, each with its own story. Some were named after shapes that looked like human organs, like the birth canal. Others, such as the Scout Eater, alluded to the cave's notorious history. Meanwhile, there were those that were hinted at just how tough it was to get through, like the maze and the Big Slide. The Big Slide was the cave's largest section and of course incredibly slick, but the birth canal was something else entirely. Cavers who made it there described it as a ridiculously tight squeeze that just got narrower and narrower the deeper you went, and then finally it opened up into a larger space, giving you this strange feeling of being born all over again. It sounded exactly like the kind of thrill John and Josh were after. So on November 24th of 2009, bright and early, The two of them, along with 10 friends and family members, wriggled their way into the Nutty Putty cave. They started by checking out the big slide, but their main goal was to tackle the birth canal. Splitting into 2 groups, the rest of the family kept doing their thing, while John went solo to find the canal. After a while of searching, he finally stumbled upon a narrow squeeze. Thinking it might lead him to the birth canal, he decided to crawl through it. A few minutes in, he spotted a hole in the wall that looked just like what he'd read about at the canal's entrance. Even though he wasn't entirely sure, something inside him told him to go for it. So trusting his gut, he plunged in headfirst. As he moved forward, he kept hoping the squeeze would open up into the birth canal, but instead, it was just getting tighter. It was like hitting a brick wall, but the weird part was he had no idea what was going on. The tightness should have freaked anyone out, but he was on a high from the adventure, treating it like some kind of thrilling challenge instead of a terrifying ordeal. He crawled for what felt like ages, but the squeeze never seemed to give. With each inch, he lost all sense of direction. At one point, he did enter the birth canal, but somewhere along the way, veered off unknowingly and ended up in a totally different section, the Scout Eater. That passage was never meant for exploring. It was just way too tight for anyone to navigate, hence the deadly name. Eventually, he came to a sharp, almost vertical drop. He was buzzing with excitement, thinking this might be the spot in the birth canal that would open up to a big, spacious area, but once again, he was wrong. Unaware of the trouble ahead, he continued down the tunnel, which was now so tight, it barely measured 10 inches by 18 inches. Then out of nowhere, reality hit him like a freight train. Instead of discovering an open chamber, he found himself face to face with a dead end. The narrow passage had led him to a point of no return, and he was stuck upside down. Panicking, he tried to push himself back through the hole, but lost his grip and fell into it. He called for help, and his brother Josh came to see what was wrong. When Josh arrived, he tried to pull John up by the legs, making some headway, but then he slipped from Josh's grasp and slid back into the crevice. This time even tighter, with one hand pinned beneath him and the other twisted awkwardly behind him. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he and Josh quickly said a prayer, then Josh bolted out of the cave to get help. Rescuers from the Utah SAR office responded to the incident. They had rescued a couple of people already from the cave, with one of them from the exact same spot, so they were confident they'd be able to rescue John. The first person on the scene was a woman named Susie Matola. By the time she crawled in there, John had been stuck for 3 hours, 30 meters or 100 feet underground. John greeted her with a weary, exhausted voice. "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really want to get out of here." Over the next few hours, scores of rescuers showed up and got to work, trying everything they could to get him free. They decided to use climbing cams. They threaded a rope through the cams, strapped it to his legs, and pulled him up. While doing that, they also started drilling into the rock to widen the tunnel, but that was a very slow process. The passages were so tight that it took over an hour just to chip away a few inches of rock. That, however, was just one of the several complications. The way John had slid into the hole made things trickier. The ceiling was so low that they couldn't just pull him straight up. They had to lift him a little, adjust, and then lift him again, repeating the whole process over and over until he was totally free. There was barely any room to maneuver, and the rescuers could hardly get to him themselves. The first attempt with the climbing cams didn't cut it, so the team switched to using pulleys bolted to the cave walls, but that was another slow slog because of the narrow space. With nearly 100 rescuers working non-stop, only one person could reach John at a time, making the whole operation painstakingly dreadful and long. 19 hours into the rescue, his body was starting to break down, and frustration was mounting. He stayed as calm as he could, but the claustrophobia sometimes hit him with full-blown panic. Being trapped upside down for so long was making it hard for his heart to push blood up to his brain, and it was causing him to hallucinate. To help him cope with the agony, a two-way radio was lowered down so he could talk to his wife. Despite the dire situation, they did their best to comfort each other. After what felt like forever, the rescuers finally finished drilling and setting up the pulleys to lift him out. As they began to pull, the pain in his legs became almost unbearable, and they had to take frequent breaks. But slowly, he was making progress, and hope sparked when he locked eyes with a rescuer. He was exhausted, but through the pain, he managed to offer a smile. But then, just when it seemed like he was almost free, everything fell apart. The entire team yanked backward, and the rope went slack. A terrifying crash echoed through the tunnel, and dust filled the space. When it finally settled, the rescuer closest to him was knocked out, and he realized the pulley had broken free. To make matters worse, he had slipped back into the crevice even deeper than before. The pain was excruciating, but worse was the helplessness. The unconscious rescuer was replaced, and when the new one arrived, John Jones was fading. The new guy gave it all, trying to drill a hole for the pulley system or using a jackhammer to widen the hole, but sheer exhaustion got the best of him too. On top of that, the cramped space made it impossible to get a good angle of the job. Another rescuer took over, but by then, John was barely hanging on. The shadows before his eyes grew darker and darker until he couldn't see or hear anything at all, slipping into unconsciousness. Not long after, he blacked out. A medical professional crawled into the cave, checked him over, and declared him dead at midnight on November 25th of 2009. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, and despite the relentless efforts of 137 rescuers working around the clock for 27 hours, they couldn't save John Jones from the depths of the Nutty Putty Cave. The next day, authorities decided it was too risky to try and recover the body, so with his family's consent, they poured cement over the entrance, sealing the cave for good, while John's body remains there to this day, making Nutty Putty Cave his final resting place. It's Sunday, July 13th of 1997. The morning light has just started to illuminate the scenic wilderness of Veryovkina Park. A resident from Springfield, Virginia is taking a stroll through the wooded trails, surrounded by thick forest. He moves past a giant shelter of trees to reach an open area beneath the famous Springfield Railway Bridge. Summer has set in and birds are chirping, but despite the mesmerizing scenery, the man is about to stumble upon a sight that will rip away the joy and peace of the moment forever. Lying twisted and broken on the cold pavement below the railway bridge is the mangled body of a young man, his limbs unnaturally bent in horrific angles. His skin is torn, exposing flesh and bone, and his face is barely recognizable. Attached to the man's legs are several short ropes, frayed and knotted, stretching upward and still tethered to the bridge above. The stunned and horrified man, with trembling hands, backs away from the gruesome sight and quickly calls the Fairfax County Police. They waste no time, arriving at the scene promptly, and soon after, a wide-scale investigation is launched, revealing some truly strange and disturbing details. The victim was identified as 22-year-old fast food worker Eric Garcia, and the ropes wrapped tightly around his lifeless body were bungee cords, apparently from a poorly conceived stunt that had gone terribly wrong. However, the events that led to this tragic outcome were far more strange than anyone could have imagined. The night before, on Saturday, after finishing his shift at the local fast food joint, Eric finally decided it was his time to pull off the thrill ride he'd been obsessing over for so long. Bungee jumping had always been on the top of his list, and for weeks, he'd been trying to find the perfect spot to make it happen. Unfortunately, there weren't any professional jumping stations nearby, and he couldn't justify the travel expenses just for this one activity. So being the determined 22-year-old he was, Eric decided to go for it all by himself. Interestingly, to undertake this disturbing stunt, he came out with a pretty meticulous approach. For days, he kept on researching the cords and safety belts, while also going through some instructional guides, piecing together tips on how to safely pull off a jump without having access to the proper equipment. Once he had that figured out, the next step was picking the right spot. It had to be high up and sturdy enough to secure his cords before the freefall. Thinking of it, the only place that met these criteria was the railway bridge over Lake Veryovkina Park. It offered a 70-foot drop and had rails that seemed perfect for anchoring his setup, so after finishing his usual routine on the weekend of July 12th, Eric gathered all his makeshift gear and headed to the railway bridge. From there, he had a clear view of the park's concrete pavement far below. He tied several cords to the railway tracks, checking and rechecking each knot to make sure it was secure. Then, for the final touch, he wrapped the other ends of the cords tightly around his waist, and instead of using buckles, reinforced them with duct tape. Despite how questionable that choice was, his plan looked solid on paper, at least to him, although in reality, it was a huge miscalculation. During his preparation, Eric missed a simple yet crucial detail. Bungee cords stretch during a jump. For example, if a person jumps off a bridge, the cords stretch and pull them back up before they reach the very bottom of the fall. This means the cords need to be shorter than the total fall distance to account for the stretch. Eric, however, prepared his bungee cord to the exact length of the fall. This meant there was no extra room for a stretch, and he would end up falling directly onto the pavement, head first, without any rebound or safety. But unaware of this fatal oversight, he gave the knots and duct tape one final check, and then leaped off the tracks, and seconds later, he would find himself crashing into the concrete ground with such brutal impact that it killed him instantly. The next couple of hours, his lifeless body would lie there until the darkness of night passed. It was only then that the local resident came across the scene and called the cops, but by that time, it was already too late, and Eric had paid the ultimate price for his unnecessary adventure. November 1st, 2020, a resident of Veryovkina in the Sochi district in southern Russia, 37-year-old Sergei Kozev is saying goodbye to his family, having told them he is going on the mountains to soak up some nature. It's something he does all the time, and his family's used to it. Being a mountain enthusiast, Sergei hits the trails as a hobby quite often, going on these epic expeditions that can stretch on for months. But since he loves it, that's all worth it. So doing what he always does, he gives his wife and 2 kids a quick hug and heads out in the car. It's been ages since his last trip, and he's really pumped about it. But there's a little twist to his journey that's not quite what it seems. Instead of his usual campaign, Sergei has his sights set on something a bit different this time around. Changing up his normal route, he drives his car about 15 to 20 kilometers from his hometown, across the Sau River, crossing over the Russian border, and entering Abkhazia, a disputed Georgian territory nearby. Once across, you keep driving along the coast, heading toward Gagra, a town that's pretty much the gateway to the rugged mountain regions further in. From there, the route takes climbers towards the Arabica Massif Mountains, navigating through unpaved and sometimes pretty steep roads until they finally reach the base camp. At this point, it's all on foot, where climbers trek through a wild karst landscape filled with limestone formations, sinkholes, and underground rivers, climbing to an elevation of 2,285 meters or 7,497 feet. This is where they'd come up upon a massive 3x4 meter hole in the ground, surrounded by craggy cliffs. While this might just look like another sinkhole or cave mouth among the countless craters and caverns scattered across the area, it's actually the entrance to the Veryovkina, the deepest known cave in the world, dropping a mind-boggling 2,203 meters or 7,257 feet down and stretching out 17,500 meters or 57,400 feet underground. Sergei had been eyeing this daring adventure for almost a year, but there was a catch. Most expeditions to Veryovkina are led by teams of seasoned pros under tightly controlled conditions and extreme risk management. In fact, he was inspired by a group of Russian cavers who tried to reach the bottom but were forced back by a massive flood. And despite knowing that a whole team of experts had failed, he still went ahead and decided to take on this challenge all by himself. On top of that, nobody knew he was planning to take such a dangerous mission solo. He didn't even bother getting an official permit to dive into the cave. As for experience, Sergei was a decent climber, but had only recently gotten into spelunking, with just 2 previous caving experiences under his belt and a whole lot of crazy enthusiasm, which of course wasn't nearly enough to pull off such a risky stunt. But without a clue about what was coming, Sergei geared up his camo overalls and trekking boots, tied a rope to a rocky ledge, and started lowering himself into the abyss with a lattice descender. To make getting down to the Veryovkina Cave a bit easier, spelunking groups had set up 6 camps at different depths. These spots were where cavers could take a breather before pushing on, because getting to the bottom wasn't something you could knock out in a day. Sergei had all this info, maps, terrain details, and everything else saved as screenshots on his phone, which explains his laid-back attitude about tackling the beast of a cave. The first part of the descent was mostly straight down, but after that, Sergei hit a bunch of tight, horizontal tunnels where he had to climb on his stomach or scramble over rocky obstacles before dropping down again. Eventually, he made it about 380 meters or 1,250 feet down, where he found the first camp. So far, everything had been pretty smooth sailing, so he most likely wasn't worried at all. At Camp 1, he took a break for a few hours, swapped out his wet clothes, and grabbed some food. He also found some gear that earlier expeditions had left behind, so he picked up whatever seemed useful and got ready to keep going deeper. From Camp 1, the path forward wasn't all that clear. To go deeper into the cave, he had to backtrack a bit uphill to get back on the main descent route. But once there, the descent to Camp 2 would be a bit easier than the first leg. Camp 2 had more supplies left behind, including a makeshift toilet, some cooking gas, and a bit of leftover food. The biggest lifesavers, though, were the sleeping bags. He was wiped out and needed some serious rest, so this was going to be his crash pad for the whole week, somewhere he could kick back, recharge, and figure out his next move. But with that bit of comfort came the first big red flag of this bizarre journey. His lifeline up to now, all the maps and notes he'd been gathering for a year, were stored on his phone, which was now dead, leaving him completely on his own. Ideally, he should have returned from there, but nothing about this whole trip was ideal until now, so why would this be any different? He decided to continue his journey, which was perhaps a few hundred meters away from turning into a total disaster. As he pushed onward, aiming for Camp 3, just 200 meters to go, the freezing water and plummeting temperatures started to get under his skin. That's when another major flaw in his preparations reared its head, possibly the deadliest one. Just like his experience, his gear wasn't up to the cave's extreme conditions. He was supposed to have a wetsuit to handle the freezing weather from several underground streams, but from the start, he'd been taking what's known as the most dangerous spelunking expedition a bit too casually. The temperature dropped like a rock in this part of the cave, and Sergei was getting soaked by freezing water left and right. Now, even if he wanted to turn back, he couldn't because he didn't bring any clamps or stirrups to help him climb up. His only choice was to keep going down, hoping that Camp 3 might have some gear to help him get back up or protect him from the brutal cold. What started as an exciting adventure had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Somehow making it through the toughest portion of the cave yet, Sergei finally reached Camp 3. But to his utter disappointment, there was nothing there to help him out. Panic set in, and he felt death closing in within the claustrophobic walls of the cave. At this point, he had two choices: wait around for death to catch up, or push on to Camp 4, which was 350 meters further into the cave, and hope for a miracle. He chose the latter, but as he kept ascending, the conditions only got worse. Each step downward was a battle. The air was so frigid it burned his lungs, and every breath was like inhaling shards of ice. The icy water wasn't flowing down like a waterfall anymore. It was pooling around his feet, soaking his clothes, and seeping into his skin. On top of that, his hands, already numb and shaking, struggled to hold onto the slick, wet ropes, while his muscles refused to listen to his frantic commands. He pressed on past the 1,100 meter or 3,600 foot mark, but the tight, dark tunnel of despair was closing in on him. Suddenly, his foot slipped on a loose rock. He swung wildly on the rope, slamming into the icy, jagged cave wall. From that point on, he couldn't muster the strength to regain his grip, and just dangled there as hypothermia set in. Weeks passed with no sign of him, and his wife finally reported him missing. Despite a massive search effort, no one could find him. Then on August 4th of 2021, the Perovsky Club members on an expedition to Veryovkina discovered his decayed, unrecognizable body hanging from the rope 1,100 meters or 3,600 feet down in the cave. They used his phone's SIM cards to find his photos and track down his family, but since the body was in rough shape and the cave was such a death trap, it was impossible to get his remains out in one piece. So Sergei's family gave official permission for a team of about 100 cavers to cut him into manageable pieces and haul him out of the cave. June 2nd, 1997, 3 p.m. on the dot. A female lifeguard at Waterworld USA Concord is in full-blown panic mode. Perched high at her station, she blares her whistle violently and yells at the top of her lungs, sending out warnings that are absolutely urgent. Down below her station, several onlookers are gathered with their eyes on a particular attraction called the Banzai Pipeline Slide, a twisting, adrenaline-pumping behemoth of a ride. Over 30 students are packed at the top of it, impatient and rowdy, pushing the limits of the ride's safety rules. One after another, they're hurling themselves down the slick slide, ignoring the critical safety gaps between riders. The lifeguard's shouting gets more desperate as she waves her arms frantically, trying to stop the reckless stampede. But moments later, not only would her efforts go up in smoke, but the once lively atmosphere would take a nosedive into a dark, disturbing pit, turning into a blood-soaked calamity. 18-year-old Quimby Jaloti was a very bright student. Throughout her 4 years at Napa High School in California, she was on the honor roll, maintaining a 3.5 GPA. Besides her academic achievements, she was super involved, working as a student assistant, counselor, and peer mediator. She had her sights set on California State University at Sacramento, where she planned to study psychology in the fall of 1997. But before all of that, as her final year was wrapping up, Quimby and her classmates were hyped up for their senior trip to Waterworld USA Concord, one of the area's most popular parks known for its wild rides. In the days leading up to it, they couldn't stop planning. Every little detail of the trip was mapped out, wanting it to be an unforgettable experience. At their school, it was almost a tradition for the senior class to go on one last trip before graduation. And of course, the stories from these trips always made their way down to the juniors, keeping the tradition alive year after year. Quimby and her classmates had been through the same thing. All throughout their senior year, they'd been hearing this so-called record legend about the previous graduating class. Apparently, the whole class had climbed up a specific slide in the park at the same time, got it completely clogged on the way down, and then slid into the pool together holding hands. As reckless as it was, to a bunch of high schoolers, it sounded like pure thrill. and during the planning phase, some of them saw it as a challenge to beat that record when they got to the park. The idea spread like wildfire, and before long the whole class was in on the plan to pull off the risky stunt. As the days tickled by, excitement kept building, and then June 2nd, 1997 finally arrived. The students showed up at Waterworld early that morning, buzzing with anticipation as they piled out of the buses. Every sight of towering slides and sparkling pools had them ready to go. After a quick orientation, they scattered in every direction, fired up and ready to take on the park. By mid-morning, they had already zipped down the most popular slides, raced against each other in the wave pool, and floated down the lazy river to catch their breath. Some grouped up, daring each other to tackle the scariest rides, while others chilled, splashing around in the shallows. As the hours passed, the energy only ramped up. They had checked off almost every ride on their list, pushing each other to go higher, faster, and wilder. It was already a carefree, adventurous day so far, and now it was the time to take it to the next level. At around 3 p.m., excitement was buzzing through the group as they gathered around the Banzai pipeline slide. This monster of a slide stood more than 12 meters or 40 feet tall, towering over the entire park. Its long, twisting path was filled with heart-pounding turns, offering both a view and a thrill that was unmatched. From the top, you could see the entire water park spread out below, with the vantage point almost as dizzying as the drop itself. More than 30 students made their way to the top of the slide, climbing the stairs, eager to take the plunge. One by one, they started shooting down the slide, but soon enough, things picked up pace. Normally on a slide that high, you're supposed to wait a few minutes between riders to keep things safe, and even though they were told the rules, they completely blew them off, since they had the plan to clog the slide midway, eventually going down together. What they didn't know was that they'd definitely be going down, but not exactly how they imagined. The group kept rushing down the slide one after another, not bothering to wait, and in no time, at least 33 of them were piled up on it, completely clogging the slide. In the chaos, Quimby was there too, just as pumped and excited, totally oblivious to the trouble they had created. Meanwhile, the lifeguard on duty was freaking out. At first, she tried to stop the hyped up teens by shouting warnings and even physically blocking their way, but with just her against the wild crowd, she was pretty much powerless. Plus, everything happened so fast that all she could end up doing was keep blowing the whistle and yelling, hoping to grab the attention of other staff members, or perhaps give the kids one final warning, but nothing worked in the moment. By the time the last student came sliding down, the slide was so jam-packed that he ended up stuck just a meter down, close enough that he could almost reach back to the platform with his arm. About 30 minutes in, finally happened what was pretty much obvious. The slide was way overloaded, carrying 4 times its usual limit. While the fiberglass structure could hold more than usual, it was no match for this overwhelming weight. In front of several stunned onlookers who had gathered to witness the commotion, the Banzai pipeline slide began to bend unnervingly in the middle. The students stuck in that part of the slide suddenly realized the impending danger, and that's when sheer panic took over. Screams filled the air as those in the middle of the tube tried desperately to scramble back towards the platform, but they were trapped. Students were above and below, leaving no room to escape. It took a few seconds for the entire group to realize that the ride was collapsing, but before anyone could act, it was already too late. The slide's surface cracked at 11 meters or 37 feet in the air, sending the students tumbling down to the unforgiving concrete floor. Even the ones who were still at the top, just a few steps away from the platform, couldn't climb back. One after another, they kept falling down, their bodies crashing with a series of sickening, loud thuds. Some were knocked out cold, others were screaming in pain and terror, and a few just lay, crumbled, and motionless. To make things worse, some of them landed on top of each other, adding to the tragedy. The pool water turned red with blood, mixing with the splashes and the foam. Everyone around the area gasped in horror and rushed to help the injured kids. The lifeguard's panic turned to frantic action as she, alongside the others from the staff, raced to the scene, calling for emergency assistance while trying to make sense of the situation. Shortly after, one of the lifeguards, Franks, found Quimby all covered in blood and mud. Out of all 33 students, she was the worst off. Her chest was crushed, and she'd slammed her head pretty hard against the wooden support poles of the slide during the fall. Though she was conscious at first, despite Franks doing everything he could to keep her awake, She passed out on the way to the hospital and died about 45 minutes after the accident. The rest of the students were taken to 9 different hospitals where they spent weeks being treated for their severe injuries. Right after the incident, the park was shut down and an investigation kicked off. The parents of the teenagers involved, including Quimby's family, hit the park with a lawsuit claiming the slide was poorly constructed and that the park's security failed to stop the disaster. They also accused Napa High School of ignoring the students' plans after overhearing their discussions. But a few days later, the final report of the investigation came out, clearing the park of any wrongdoing. The slide met all the safety standards, and several students testified that the lifeguard at the slide station had repeatedly warned them not to try the stunt, but they were too pumped up to listen. Still, the park's parent company ended up shelling out about $4 million in compensation, with $1.7 million going to Quimby's family. Her memorial service took place at the school a week later, where 800 students gathered to bid her a final farewell. Some of them were her classmates, still wearing bandages and splints, where they may have been wondering what could have been if they just chose to enjoy themselves instead of chasing after those so-called records. October 1st, 1995. Tens of thousands of onlookers are gathered along the banks of Niagara River for an extraordinary spectacle. 39-year-old Robert Overacker is about to ride a jet ski off the edge of Horseshoe Falls, equipped with a rocket-powered parachute. Several cameras are capturing this hair-raising stunt as he enters the river near the Canadian Niagara power plant and races headlong towards the falls. Among the crowd are his family and friends, all cheering him on and hoping for the best. The plan is to plunge over the 51-meter or 167-foot drop on the jet ski, deploy the parachute, and touch down safely in the icy waters below before swimming to shore. For what he hopes to achieve, the goal is to draw as much attention as possible to raise awareness for the plight of homeless people. But moments later, tragedy struck. Born on the 4th of July in 1956 in Santa Monica, California, Robert Overacker grew up with the Pacific Ocean as his backdrop. From a young age, he was drawn to nature and the thrill of pushing his limits. Throughout his growing years, he mastered a lot of acrobatic and athletic skills, honing his talents and igniting his interest in extreme sports. However, it initially didn't seem to be a suitable profession to make a good living, so he ended up bouncing between several jobs, none of which could fit his free-roaming spirit he had. Then, during his teenage years, he fell in love with another cause that changed his life. Throughout his childhood in California, he saw the struggles of homeless people up close. For a bit of context, California has the highest percentage of homeless individuals in the US even today. There are over 180,000 people without any proper housing. While these numbers continue to rise every year back in the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't any less of an issue. Robert, who was close to nature, became passionate about helping his community. He realized he could leverage his love for extreme sports to shine a spotlight on the issue, so he started doing shows and public displays to support this cause. Though he did manage to grab some attention, it wasn't the big change he'd hoped for. Still, he kept at it, waiting for the perfect opportunity to make a greater impact. When he turned 32, he came up with this deadly plan of falling through Niagara Falls on a jet ski. It was hands down his most daring stunt yet, and the potential rewards were equally massive. If he pulled it off, he'd grab a ton of spotlight, which would help him gather the resources he needed to back his cause. The responsibility was huge, and he wanted to make sure he was fully ready. So for the next 7 years, he spent his time planning and prepping for it, even though his friends and family were continuously trying to prevent him from doing it. A couple of times, he got really close to going through with it, but kept pushing it off because of their constant disapproval. As one of the most dangerous in the world, Niagara's Horseshoe Falls dropped 51 meters or 167 feet with insane force, creating unpredictable currents at the bottom. On top of the freezing waters, jet skiing down those falls meant not only dealing with the height and impact, but also the sheer power of the river, which could make the control nearly impossible. Even with a parachute, the brutal winds could mess with deployment, making it too risky to avoid crashing into the rocky base or getting swept into lethal whirlpools. While he couldn't do much to eliminate all the risks, over the years he had come up with an idea to use a rocket-propelled parachute, also known as a ballistic chute, instead of the regular kind. These types of parachutes are used when you're close to the ground, or when the air is so unpredictable that a standard parachute might take too long to fully deploy, so the rocket propulsion attached to it helps the parachute open instantly, cutting down on the risk big time. With enough on-paper planning, Robert finally decided to go for the daring attempt in late 2001. On October 1st, he was joined by his family and a crowd of several onlookers gathered at Niagara Falls, as well as on the rooftops of neighboring buildings and restaurants, all of whom had their cameras ready to record him completing the leap. At 12:35 p.m., Robert entered the Canadian Horseshoe Falls and began jet skiing towards the edge, picking up speed fast. In just moments, he reached the drop-off, letting go of the ski as he plunged into the 51-meter fall. He went to deploy the rocket-propelled parachute strapped to his back, but unfortunately, the unexpected occurred. The crowd watched in horror as he plummeted straight into the white churning waters below, completely consumed by the massive waterfall. His parachute never opened. It turns out at the very last moment, he hadn't packed it properly, and worse, it wasn't even securely attached to him. As the water swallowed him, he vanished from sight, leaving everyone on edge. After several minutes, his body resurfaced, being tossed around by the powerful waves. At first, people thought he might still be alive because the strong currents made it look like he was swimming, but it quickly became clear that his body was just being thrown around by the force of the water, completely lifeless. 2 days later, authorities recovered his body, and he was officially pronounced dead at the nearby hospital. The cause of death was drowning since his body had no broken bones, meaning he didn't hit the rocks, and if that parachute had worked, he might have actually made it out alive. The American Sprint Car Series, also known as ASCS, is one of the most electrifying racing spectacles in the United States, featuring high-powered, open-wheel vehicles engineered for short-track battles that push the limits of speed and control. With tight turns and hard-stopping finishes on dirt or paved ovals, this high-octane sport demands a relentless go-for-broke mindset where drivers willingly hurl themselves into extremely high-risk endeavors, chasing victory at high speeds. As long as it's confined to the track, that attitude is safe enough, but sometimes it can go off the rails into recklessness, setting the stage for catastrophe and entirely avoidable disasters. The 2003 ASCS National Champion settled in the Dallas area town of Forney, Texas. Travis Rylott was running a car interior business with his wife, Mariana, by 2010. After earning his title, the couple had moved to Forney when their parents, Dorothy and Greg, closed up their longtime bait and tackle shop on the Texas City Dike. The shop had been a local resource for fishermen for years, but Hurricane Ike wiped it out in 2008. Losing the family business was tough, but Travis wasn't the type to stay down. He bounced back, starting his own venture while still keeping his racing career alive, and it wasn't long before he found success in both. That's also when he met Tyson Perez, a crazy fellow with the same drive. Travis brought him on as a crew chief and got him selling exotic race car parts at the shop. Hailing from Australia, Perez brought a unique flair to the job. As the crew chief, he was the brains behind Travis's race car strategies and car setups, while also being a go-to resource on the sales floor. The duo clicked well and everything was going pretty smoothly until mid-2010, when Travis got an invite to a series of races in Washington. They wasted no time heading over, ready to hit the ground. But what awaited them was far beyond anything they'd imagined. During their preparations round, one random evening on July 18th, 2010, after wrapping up work on their car at the workshop, they came up with a wild idea. What would happen if they rode a barrel of fire like a rocket? The answer must have been more intriguing than the question, and they couldn't resist finding that out. So they decided they would pick up an empty 55-gallon barrel, rig it up to fire from behind while they sat on it, and take a thrilling ride, expecting it to zoom down the parking lot rapidly like a rocket. In hindsight, this was an attempt at suicide, especially with their decision to fill the barrel with 4 gallons of methanol to spark the fire. They were basically setting up a bomb, but their adventure-seeking minds didn't quite grasp the danger at the time. So sticking to their unsettling plan, they filled the barrel, took a seat on it, and lit it. But instead of the anticipated excitement, all they heard was a loud whoosh, followed by a massive explosion. The blast was so intense that one end of the barrel was flung 37 meters or 120 feet away, leaving the men severely burned. After a few hours, the parking lot was swarming with paramedics and firefighters, and when they were rushed to the hospital, both were still conscious. Medical teams assessed their injuries as third-degree burns covering up to 62% of their bodies, with damage reaching down to fat, muscle, and even bone in some places. The duo was airlifted to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle for advanced care. That worked well for Travis as he began to show signs of recovery, but Tyson couldn't handle the excruciating pain and agony and succumbed to death 2 days later. Following the disturbing event, Several sponsors from the racing community came forward and set up funds to support Travis in managing the lengthy medical bills. After a years-long recovery, he made his comeback on the racetrack in 2018, picking up right where he left off. Around the rugged terrains of northern Pakistan, just short of the border with China, there's a narrow, winding path that snakes through the valleys of the Karakoram Range, leading to a hidden clearing. Here, the giant peaks part like curtains, unveiling a vast, dramatic expanse where the air is thin and the sky seems to stretch forever. This is where the last human settlement of the region, Ascole, marks the point beyond which normal life ceased to exist. No people, no infrastructure, and no transport. From here, the gateway opens to a brutal, icy wilderness that stretches out for a grueling 7-day trek to reach the world's most treacherous and second highest mountain, Karakoram 2, better known as K2. Climbers describe K2 as a massive, relentless pyramid of ice and jagged rocks. It earned the nickname the Savage Mountain in 1953 when American mountaineer George Bell famously remarked, "It's a savage mountain that tries to kill you." This statement remained haunting the climbers up until 2021, as for every 4 people who made it to the top, 1 would die on the way back. Though recent years have seen a slight increase in successful climbs, but that doesn't take away from the mountain's scary reputation as a total killer. Born on February 2nd of 1976, Muhammad Ali would later be known as Muhammad Ali Sadpara, named after his remote village in the far north of Pakistan. As the youngest of 11 kids, growing up at such a high altitude gave Ali more strength and endurance than most people, which would later make him fall in love with mountains. Ali's family struggled financially. His father worked a low-level government job, and with so many mouths to feed, resources were always tight. After finishing junior high in their village, Ali's father moved the family to a nearby town to give Ali a chance to continue his education. Although he was a bright student, the family's financial hardship cut that dream short. So Ali jumped into the workforce right after high school, and choosing a career was a pretty straightforward task. Sitting right at the doorstep of some of the world's highest peaks, Ali's hometown drew tons of international tourists and mountaineers eager to summit those giant mountains. But it wasn't just about trekking and climbing. Hauling all the gear up to the base camps was another big job. That's where local, young guys would make a living. They served as high-altitude porters, lugging heavy loads up the mountains for the climbers and tourists in exchange for some cash. With his impressive physique and stamina, Ali seemed like a natural fit for the job, but his tight finances made the already grueling work even more challenging. Day in and day out, Ali would carry back-breaking loads up the dangerous mountains, doubling as both a porter and a tour guide with nothing but makeshift gear and sometimes even flip-flops. Yet his exceptional fitness made it all seem easy. Expeditioners often recalled how they'd be gasping for air and struggling to keep up, while Ali would be jogging up the steep inclines and calling back to them to hurry up. As his reputation soared, so did his love for the mountains. Becoming a well-known porter in the village, he started joining extended campaigns with international teams, all while still carrying gear for them. Despite being a porter, his experience earned him respect that went beyond just his job title. Expert mountaineers from all over began looking to him as a mentor and guide, seeking his advice on crucial ascents. In 2006, Ali conquered the 13th tallest mountain in the world and his first 8,000er peak, Gasherbrum 2. For a bit of context, the term 8,000ers refers to the 14 mountains that top 8,000 meters, or 26,247 feet, as recognized by the International Mountaineering and Climbing Federation. Over the years, he became the only Pakistani to summit 8 of these 14 giants, with 5 of them in Pakistan. By 2016, he had set his sights on something even more extraordinary. He led a 3-man team to become the first ever to climb Naga Parbat, the 9th highest peak in the world, during the winter. Known as the Man-Eater or Killer Mountain for its sheer vertical slopes and brutal temperatures that plummet to negative 51 degrees Celsius, Naga Parbat lived up to its fearsome reputation. This high-profile adventure brought Ali even more fame, stoking his relentless spirit. Over the next few years, he continued his daring expeditions, which included summiting the 4th and 5th highest mountains and climbing some 8,000er peaks multiple times, like Naga Parbat, which he scaled 4 times over a total span of 9 years. In January of 2018, Ali joined forces with the Basque mountaineer Alex Teichen to take on Mount Everest, aiming to summit the world's highest peak without supplemental oxygen during the brutal winter season. This formidable challenge required enduring temperatures as low as negative 60 degrees Celsius and fierce hurricane-force winds, all while relying on their natural lung capacity. It was a long shot, and in the end, The harsh conditions forced the duo to turn back without reaching the summit. But Ali's wild and unpredictable dreams weren't about to be sidelined. Later that year, he ended up summiting K2 for the first time. Although it was a standard climb without any extraordinary risks, it didn't take him long to be ready for another one. Fast forward to 2021, with post-COVID lockdowns easing, tourism in Pakistan was starting to bounce back, and so was a deadly race in the climbing community. Just a couple of weeks into the new year, on January 16th, an international team of 10 climbers made history with the first ever winter summit of K2. While the ascent was a huge success, the return proved fatal when a Spanish climber died during the descent. This groundbreaking achievement grabbed headlines worldwide. Ali felt the heat and wanted to set a new record himself. If winter climbs were now a reality, he needed to push his limits even farther, so he set his sights on reaching the summit without supplemental oxygen. A challenge he'd attempted on Everest before, but this time, he was determined to make it happen. His chance came just a month later. An Icelandic mountaineer, John Snorri, and a Chilean climber, Juan Pablo, hired him as a porter for their K2 expedition. Seeing this as a golden opportunity, Ali decided to bring his 20-year-old son, Sajid, along for the daring adventure. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and he wanted his son to be part of it. Sajid was no stranger to mountaineering himself. He had already summited K2 in 2019, along several other notable peaks as well. The group grew to about 25 to 30 hikers. However, as they faced the brutal negative 80 degrees Celsius temperatures and the treacherous terrain, the others turned back, one by one, leaving the original 4 mountaineers to continue. After spending several days at the base camp, acclimating at around 5,000 meters or 16,400 feet, Ali and his crew finally started their summit push on February 3rd, 2021 at 4 a.m. About 7 hours later, the same day at 11 a.m., the team makes it past Camp 1, hitting an elevation of 6,000 meters, continuing their ascent with a steady pace. 7 more hours on the move, they finally reach Camp 2. It's been nearly 14 hours since they started, so they decide to call it a night and rest up at Camp 2. The day has been long and taxing, but the climbers were determined to push forward. The next morning, February 4th, 2021 at 8 a.m., after almost 15 hours of rest, they started their climb up the Black Pyramid, aiming to reach Camp 3 and hit 7,350 meters or 24,100 feet by the end of their day. Sticking to their plan, the group reaches Camp 3 about 12 hours later. Worn out from a full day of climbing, they gear up for the final push to the summit, but first they take a 4.5-hour break, resting and getting their equipment ready, knowing the toughest part of their journey is still ahead. The night changes from the 4th to February 5th, a day that would unleash the most terrifying event of their lives. Around 1 a.m., the team sets off from Camp 3 for the summit, enduring a brutal climb that could take up to 14 hours on a good day. But the weather takes a nasty turn, delaying their progress and making things even more dangerous. Still, the daring climbers would continue their ascent in extreme conditions without any supplemental oxygen. At around 8,200 meters, what should have been a 14-hour trek is dragging on, and even after 17 hours, they're still 400 meters or 1,300 feet short, stuck in the bottleneck, the most dangerous part of the mountain. Here, the steep slope can reach 60 degrees, and enormous ice blocks hang overhead, ready to crash down at any moment. As they push on, Ali's son, Sajid, starts to struggle. This is when it hits them. Coming without oxygen may not have been the best plan. Ali urges Sajid to use the emergency oxygen tank, but when Sajid tries to use it, he finds out the mask regulator is leaking. Meanwhile, Ali and the other 2 climbers keep pushing up through the bottleneck. Ali turns around and yells at Sajid to keep climbing. Sajid shouts back that the cylinder is busted and he doesn't have the strength to go on. He decides to turn back, planning to wait for them at Camp 3 after they'd returned from the summit. But in those bone-chilling winds and vast icy expanse, this would be the last time Sajid sees his father. Sajid would make it back to Camp 3, but what happened to the trio after that remains a chilling mystery. Almost 5 hours later at 10:44 p.m., worried by the radio silence from his father and the other climbers, he started climbing back up from Camp 3 to look for any sign of them. But despite his efforts, he didn't see any lights or spot any movement. That's when he knew something was terribly wrong. By the next day, February 6th of 2021, almost 16 to 18 hours after the group was last seen, it was assumed that Ali Satpara and his team were stuck somewhere near the bottleneck. A race against time began to reach them as quickly as possible. The Pakistani army launched a helicopter rescue operation, with some volunteer climbers stepping in to help search for the group. Despite terrible weather conditions, the rescue team kept searching, But after almost 2 days and 20 hours since they went missing, the mission had to be called off. Even so, volunteer climbers along with Shajid kept looking for the missing trio for the next 2 weeks. But by February 18th of 2021, 13 days later, it was obvious that even if the 3 of them hadn't died right away, there was no way they could have survived that long. That's when the rescue teams and the families of the missing climbers officially presumed Ali, John, and Juan dead. Fast forward 5 months, on July 26th of 2021, another trekking group discovered 3 bodies, believed to be those of the missing climbers on the slopes above Camp 4, about 300 meters or 980 feet below the K2 bottleneck. The bodies were blackened from severe frostbite, showing signs of a desperate struggle in their final moments. To this day, no one really knows what happened to the mountaineers, but there are some obvious assumptions. Since they were found 300 meters below their last location, it's believed they reached the summit but ran into trouble on the way down. They may have lost their way or got caught in severe weather, eventually succumbing to frostbite and hypoxia. During midnight of Friday on February 1st of 2008, a couple of friends on holiday at a ski resort are having a blast together. They've been here with a larger group, and it's been a fun-filled adventure so far. The resort is nestled in Saus-d'Ol, a charming little town in the metropolitan city of Turin in northern Italy, near the French border. It's one of 6 villages that make up the Via Lattea, or Milky Way, a region known for being one of the largest ski playgrounds in Europe. It offers over 400 kilometers, or 250 miles of terrain, with 140 interconnected slopes and 92 lifts that reach heights from 1,300 to 2,800 meters, catering to skiers of all levels amid stunning alpine backdrops. An amusing nonsense talk beneath a ski slope end, a certain skier, a 46-year-old British guy named David Monk, who may have had a bit too much fun as well as alcohol, came up with the idea of skiing across a giant slope. While it was nighttime and visibility was near zero, this wasn't the only thing wild about it. The intoxicated group realized they didn't have a sled or anything even close to being suitable for the job, so they figured it was a good time to set up a makeshift solution. There would usually be a couple of staff around to keep things in check. It was midnight, so the place was totally empty. Taking advantage of the situation, they ripped a few foam pads off the railing and hauled them up the mountain, hiking in pitch black darkness. It took them a while, and by the time they reached the top, the early morning light had just started to break through, but that didn't make their scheme any less dangerous. The makeshift sleds they'd created now seemed like a bigger problem than the darkness ever was. Plus, they had stripped a big chunk of protective padding right from the center of the railing, so if they reached the end of the slope, they'd be crashing straight into the metal fence. The rush of excitement and their foggy thoughts totally drowned out any sense of impending danger. The only thing that could have saved them would have been if their makeshift sleds had somehow slowed down due to resistance or friction, giving them a chance to stop midway, but that never happened. David and the group launched themselves down the slope in their mattress sleds, and within minutes, they were hurling down the hill at terrifying speeds. The rubber pads proved to be as easy to slide as a sled, however neither they could control it nor was there any protection waiting at the end of the slope. A group of people now appearing on the scene watched them barreling down the hill, cheering and shouting excitedly, and then the inevitable happened. David, leading the group down the slope, slammed right into the same spot he'd swiped the padding from. The impact was catastrophic. His head and ribs collided with the metal railing, resulting in several broken bones and punctured internal organs, and he died instantly. Meanwhile, the rest of the group, trailing behind, also went tumbling into the same gap and sustained severe injuries, but managed to survive the event. People watching the chaos rushed over as soon as they saw the group piling into the fence one after another. By the time they arrived, David was already out cold. They did everything they could to help and called for assistance, and the medical team arrived quickly and performed chest compressions on him, but unfortunately, he never woke up.